next speaker will provide you with unique insights and realistic appraisals of the current situation and offer you his own view of the future. Michael C. Digiovanni is adjunct professor at the University of Detroit Mercy in the Department of Economics. Before joining the university in 2010, Professor Digiovanni was executive director of General Motors' worldwide vehicle forecasting staff, as well as economic and industry analysis. In addition, he brings with him and to us today more than 30 years of extensive leadership experience in not only forecasting, but market research and analysis, marketing, advertising, and brand positioning. A University of Detroit graduate in economics, Professor Digiovanni is also a member of the Dean's Advisory Board of the UDM College of Liberal Arts and Education and has successfully directed the General Motors Student Corps program at the university for these 3 years. We are extremely pleased to have Professor Digiovanni with us today. He will be speaking this morning on, quote, economic forecasting as an art and as a science.
Joe, it's a pleasure to be here. Wonderful turnout. See a lot of my friendly faces out in the audience. Hopefully what I'm going to talk about today you'll find interesting in terms of learning something about forecasting and the challenges of forecasting, and maybe it might even influence several of you in the auditorium to get into economic forecasting. That's what happened to me when I was your age. I was in graduate school, as Joe mentioned, in the early 70s. I took a class in forecasting, and I said, that's what I want to do with my life. And it took me a long time to get to a point where I was living my dream at General Motors and in charge of forecasting. And, sometimes I had to pinch myself. And you'll learn today, though, that it's challenging. You ask for it, you get it, and you got to take the tough part of the job with it, and hopefully you'll get some insights into that as I speak. I want to set the background here before I get started. The forecast I'm going to present at the beginning was done in July of 2010. It's the last forecast I did before I retired from General Motors. We had just emerged from a very challenging period in our history. I was in the head of forecasting when we went through the reviews with the Auto Task Force, when we went through bankruptcy, and so I had the government looking at my forecasts, scrutinizing them very carefully, continuously. They had the Boston Consulting Group tracking our staff forecast. We were under a lot of pressure at that time from the government to really substantiate our forecast, to believe that the economy would come back, to believe that the industry would come back, to believe that GM market share would stabilize. And this was a period of time, as I said, of tremendous angst in the economy, having just emerged from the Great Recession in July of 2010. So it was a very, very difficult and uncertain time, as I'll show you today. I want to also make the point that today I'm just sharing a part, namely the industry forecast that we did. Forecasting for General Motors involves much more than that. You have to forecast segment shares, like pickups, mid-sized cars. You have to forecast GM penetration, not just at the industry level, but within each of those segment shares. And you have to forecast worldwide sales. So there's a lot that goes into it. And then finally, I'm going to focus mainly on the econometric models that we used. But there's a lot more to it than that as well. We use demographic models. We use scrappage models. There's a lot of different models. And so I guess you're probably already getting some insight in what I'm going to talk about, and that there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of art in forecasting, and hence the title, Economic Forecasting is an Art and a Science. You can't just run an econometric model, spits out the answer, you're all done, and you go home. There's too many intangibles that are seen and unforeseen that you have to try to accommodate in your forecast. One of the great lessons that I learned early in my career, I was a young economist in the early 80s in GM. I thought I had built the greatest econometric model the world had ever seen, an R squared of 9.99. And the new head of forecasting at that time had myself and two other economists. One built a demographic model, one built a cross-sectional model, who equally thought their models were the best. And we all went in for our first meeting with him, and I gave my forecast for the next 5 years. And I said, the model says this is what's going to happen, and so this is my forecast. He just about decapitated me and said, never, ever say to me, the model says. Models can't forecast for you. They give you input and they give you insight. And I said, well, how could that be? This is the greatest model ever. Well, I learned he was right over 30 years. And that's what I'm now going to talk about. So we're going to talk about forecasts that my staff, Global Market and Industry Analysis, made in July 2010, and also forecasts we made a year earlier for 1 year out in 2009. And as I said, first comes the science of forecasting. So Professor Weiglar's talked a lot about a lot of the leading indicators that we use in our forecast models. For example, he talked about employment. We actually found that employment change from quarter to quarter was better in our models than total employment. We look on the top right at vehicle sales and gas prices. We looked at change, again, as a variable, change in gas at the pump in terms of cents. So the change in gas price worked better than the level of gas price. The bottom left quadrant, vehicle sales and housing starts. That was a breakthrough in our models. Tremendous correlation there, as you can see in this chart. I'll talk about that more in a moment. And finally, in the right bottom quadrant, vehicle sales and consumer credit. Pretty good correlation there as well that truly improved our models. But if you look carefully at all four of these blocks, they don't always get exactly the peaks and troughs right, okay? And that's why you need multiple variables in your econometric models. So we have, and I'm not going to, for proprietary reasons, I can't show you the exact models, but this chart gives you a good indication. We have at the time we had seven econometric models. And as the title says, we tried various model specifications, and the refining process is a constant effort. And later, we added consumer credit, and as I said, we added housing starts. If you look at this, we used employment and gas prices in all our models. But notice how we played around with different price indices. We used the CPI that Professor Weiglar's mentioned. We used the new vehicle CPI. We used the average transaction prices of cars, which comes from a different data source. We looked at housing starts, which was in models 5, 6, and 7, and we put a regression dummy in models 1 through 4. We tried different things. The fitness, as you can see, is around 0.85, not too bad. But that's the hard part of forecasting, is hitting the peaks and the troughs. That's the hard part. Getting a good correlation because your model's going up when the economy's going up, great, and so forth when it's going down. But trying to hit those peaks and troughs, like Professor Weiglar has mentioned, if you can hit them, then you'll be a billionaire because you'll know when to get out of stocks and equities and into bonds, okay? So there's other variables in our models, but these are some of the key ones we used, and some of them build off the leading indicators that Professor Weiglar has talked about. We put housing starts in back in this period of time because of the volatility of the housing market, if you remember, back in 2009 and 10, when the housing market had plummeted. And you can see black is the actual vehicle sales, and our 7 models are shown in the various other colors. Very good correlation. Housing starts made a difference in improving our models. How well did they do? Well, this is a chart of previous recessions. Now, I'm going through the 73, 74, 79, 82, 99, 91, and the current Great Recession, where we were at, using the 7 models I talked about. If you notice in each one of them, I look at peak to trough. For example, 73, 74, the peak was in Q1 of 73, and the trough was in Q4 of 74. So this is a relatively older chart, so it doesn't come right up to the 2010 period. I'm using it for illustrative purposes, but the main takeaway, let's take model 5. That one was our best model. They're all fairly similar, but what it said was the actual peak to trough drop, as you can see, was negative 6 million units, 15.75 to 9.75 million units in 1973-74 recession. Our model said 13.99 to 11.83 drop, a drop of about 2 million units. Not that great, but at least directionally correct. It did get the peak to trough. 79-82 recession, The actual drop was 6.27 million units. Model 5 said 4.17. It's better. Got better in 90-91. Actual drop was 2.74 million units. Model predicted 1.73, pretty close. And then finally, peak to trough in the 05-08 period, when we had started to enter the Great Recession in December of 2007. Actual drop was 4.03 million, and the model was 3.93. Pretty good. So in general, we would do this. We would look at all the models, but we would lean towards one that did a better job of predicting. And in this case, it was Model 5. Now, there were other variables in here. Thought I had another chart. Okay. There were other variables in here that we used. For example, as this chart shows, disposable income is in our model. Most of the other ones I've listed: housing starts, consumer credit, which we added later, gas prices, new car prices, new and used vehicle price ratio. All of these explained over 90% of our industry movements. Pretty good. And you can see the red line is actual sales, the green line is the fitted sales, and the residual, the difference between the two, is how much we missed by. Not too bad, you'd say. Well, this is a pretty good model, so it must be easy. Well, it's not. Then comes the art. You got to forecast all the variables you just put into that econometric model. You have to get those right. If any of those you forecast are wrong, your model is going to predict wrong, right? We learned a long time ago, in the 80s, there was outfits called Data Resources, DRI. They had 100 equation econometric models. Everybody was enamored with econometrics in the 1980s because, whoa, they thought we had found the holy grail, these econometric models that could predict the future. Well, if you have a 100 equation model, you've got a ton of variables you got to predict in those 100 equation models, and it's more difficult. That's why we evolved towards single equation models, just like I just showed you. That's hard enough to forecast those variables. And then you've got to consider all the factors that are not in your model. Okay, I mentioned a couple at the outset: demographics, scrappage, and so on. Apologize for the top fonts in this chart. It's a little difficult to read, but I want to make the main point of this chart is here's where the world was in July of 2010 as we emerge from the Great Recession, which ran from December 2007 to the middle of 2009. We were just getting out of that Great Recession. The headlines at that point in time were, oh my God, are we going to slip into another second recession? Are we going to have a double dip recession? That's all the media talked about and the analysts. Why? As you can see from this chart, the global economic recovery was expected to continue, but risk remained. Even back then, the Greek crisis was going on, and countries were in heavy debt and deteriorating credit in Europe. Europe was in a mess. A lot of top executives at GM were asking me daily, is Europe going to melt down and go bankrupt and go under? So we had to decide and analyze that. Our decision was it was not going to. They were going to muddle through. Second bullet, the U.S. economy is expected to recover but may face more volatilities. The Greek fiscal problems should largely remain in the Eurozone, and the impact on the U.S. is limited, although risk spreads may increase further. Housing markets improved recently, but need to caution about payback. Consumer credit has finally returned to a small positive in Q1 of 2010, but still not exactly a robust recovery. Oil prices had retreated to a low of $70 a barrel on European concerns. Put that in perspective, in July of 2008, oil hit $148 a barrel. When they write the Harvard case studies, that was the cherry on the cake that knocked us into the Great Recession. It was the last straw that broke the camel's back, in my opinion. European growth outlook to remain gradually subdued as increasing efforts to correct fiscal imbalances slow the pace of recovery. So we were saying Europe was going to, gradually recover. They were not going to go bankrupt. Real GDP in both the Eurozone 27, or the Euro 27 and Eurozone countries only grew by 0.2% quarter to quarter in 2010 Q1. Germany announced an $80 billion deficit reduction plan. Next, there were signs of slowdown in China growth, but still robust. PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, industrial production, and fixed asset investment decelerated in May. May housing transaction volume decelerated sharply, and prices largely remained flat from May of 2009. Risk from the European fiscal crisis in China we thought was limited at that stage. Finally, solid growth at that time persisted in other major AP markets, Korea, India, Japan, Brazil, although the pace of recovery was likely to ease. Strong domestic demand in those countries was supported by favorable credit. Now, if you notice today, Japan is growing slowly, Latin America is growing slowly, Korea is growing slowly. It's a different world today, which I will get to later. But the point is, lots of uncertainty in July of 2010. Is Europe going to go under? Is China's growth, it was over 10% a year, GDP going to slow down? That'll be a really bad thing if that happens. Those two things happen. It'll probably knock us into a second recession. So there was a lot of uncertainty. So in our econometric model, you couldn't put all that in an econometric model. You had to just, that's the art. You had to accommodate that in terms of your market intelligence and then your adjustment to your forecasts that come out of your econometric models. Those variables I talked about that you had to forecast in that econometric model, number 5 that I showed you that was our best model, had to put in data like unemployment. Well, if you can see from this chart, this compares the 82, 90, 2001, and 2008 recessions quarter to quarter, apples to apples. And you can see the 82 recession in the green line and the red line being the 2008 recession. 82 recession had been the second worst recession in terms of decline in employment, the worst being the 2008 recession. The 90 recession, 2000 recession had declines in employment, but not as bad. But as you can see from this chart, as you go from 82 to 90 to 2001 to 2008, each trough on the employment drop got worse, and each recovery got slower and slower, which we're seeing today, taking longer to recover from recessions in terms of employment gains. And obviously it's taken us a long time, as Professor Weiglar said, to get to 5.7% unemployment today. It's been a long recovery. So we're looking at this and we're wondering, when is this thing going to stop falling and when's it going to turn? You got to call the turn because that's what you got to put into your econometric model. Very difficult. Same thing with housing. We had never seen a drop off in housing, which is the red line, the current 2008 recession, like we saw in the Great Recession. It really made it difficult to forecast the turning point for housing starts. You can see again the 82 recession in green, or the 80 recession, was the worst up to that point in terms of drop off in housing. But notice how all 3 other recessions shown here, housing came back fairly quickly, a typical trough peak, but not the Great Recession. We just kept going down. So we have to, as I said, housing starts turned out to be one of the best variables in our econometric model. Well, we got to forecast housing starts. Not easy to call the turn. And then finally, we put credit into our model. It was starting to work better. The banks at that point in time in the Great Recession had very tight credit. As shown in this chart, in red, you see the flow of funds into mortgages and the flow of funds into consumer credit in purple. And banks had really tightened up the flow of funds. They just weren't lending. If you don't lend, you can't recover. If people can't borrow, you can't recover from a recession. So again, trying to forecast, when were banks going to ease up? And the reason they weren't is they had been burned, and their balance sheets had been, destroyed during the Great Recession, and they were very hesitant to make loans to anybody unless they had absolutely sterling credit. Finally, I call this the unforecastable variable, oil. Unforecastable. And anybody that tells you they can forecast it is lying. As I spent a lot of my career from the early 70s to current times, predicting oil shocks is very difficult. You know they're going to come, but you just don't know when or how or why. But back in the day, it was also complicated at this point in history. This chart shows on the left the cost of OPEC's, low cost and high cost production, non-OPEC, that's the deep sea in Brazil and Russia, low cost and high cost production. Then it shows the cost of getting oil from Canadian tar sands and finally potential U.S. oil shale. As I say in this chart, back in July of 2010, our estimated cost to get an oil shale was $90 a barrel. Today we estimate it's $50 to $65 a barrel. Nobody saw this one, okay? Nobody knew we, A, would have the technology to get oil out of the ground, oil shale out of the ground with fracking at a price of $50 a barrel. No possible way. And number two, even if you could do it, there was no possible way the environmentalists would allow you to do it because you're putting high pressure water and chemicals into the ground to get that oil out, polluting potentially the water table. They'll never let you do that. So we just kind of said that's the marginal cost of doing that, being an economist, is so high, don't see it. So in July of 2010, our outlook for crude oil and U.S. gasoline prices is shown on this chart. The global economic downturn led to a decrease in global energy demand and reduction in crude oil and other energy prices, which had fallen, roughly down to $70 a barrel after that huge oil shock. Future prices, we thought, depend on the speed of the economic recovery, OPEC and non-OPEC behavior, as well as the future cost of oil production. And as I said, we missed that one. We overestimated in 2010. So if you look at our forecast on gasoline on the left and crude oil on the right, we weren't doing too bad on that, what I call this chart, JAWS, because it just shows you how hard it is to forecast oil prices. We had such a low upper bound and high upper bound. We weren't doing too bad through 2012 and 13. We were in the low end of this range. But in 2014 and 15, with the plummet in crude oil that nobody saw because of the oil shale production coming on stream, we missed it, frankly. But the good news is, this was part of being a forecaster, the dialogue we had with our, I had to present to the executive committee of General Motors every month on the outlook. And my message was always the same. It's better to plan for high energy prices and be wrong than to plan for low energy prices. Why? Because if you plan for high energy prices, three good things happen. Number one, you might be right, and they might be high, and you'll have a fuel-efficient fleet. Secondly, even if you're wrong, all your competitors are building fuel-efficient vehicles around the world. So you won't be competitive if you don't have fuel-efficient vehicles. And finally, at this point, we had no idea we were going to get mandated with 55 miles per gallon CAFE standards. But we said we're probably going to get higher CAFE standards, albeit we didn't think it'd be that high. So planning for high oil prices will help us with fuel-efficient vehicles. So that's what we did, and it was a good call. At the same point in time, this is where the art comes in, the world was incredibly volatile. This shows stock markets around the world from 2007 to 2010. Brazil, India, South Korea, China, the US, and Japan. All moved about the same. The Great Recession, you can see the huge trough there in 2008. Markets were coming back. And now notice how in 2010, they were starting to go down again. Why? Because everybody was predicting a second recession, a double-dip recession. Everybody, oh my God, this recovery is so fragile and slow, and Europe is still so weak, and China's slowing down. And so we had to make this call in General Motors. My call, and my staff's call, was there would not be a double-dip recession, that we would lumber through, okay? Okay, we admit, why? Because we saw in its infancy the comeback of the U.S. economy. We didn't. We bet that Europe would not go bankrupt and the entire continent wouldn't go under, that Germany and France would not let that happen. They had too much at stake, and whether they liked it or not would have to bail out Greece and some of the other failing countries at the time, like Spain. And we saw, early recovery. We didn't think China's growth rate was going to slow that much. It would prop up the global economy. So there was a lot of factors went into our thinking. That's the art. Now, I'm not going to go through this chart in detail. All I want to make this chart is the art of forecasting, not only what was in our model, not only the subjective things I talked about, but also these other variables, a lot of which Professor Weiglar's mentioned, went into our thinking. So we looked at real GDP, real consumption, the index of consumer sentiment, non-farm payroll enrollment, real disposable income, corporate profits, ISM manufacturing index, that's the Institute of Supply Management, new and existing home sales, West Texas Intermediate, CPI, crude oil, CPI for inflation, and the Fed's fund rate, which at that time was down to 0.13%. We looked at all these factors, and like today, we had to bet, what's the Fed going to do? And we bet they were going to stay low at their Fed funds rate. Inflation was going to stay low. And we talked about many of these other variables, so I'm not going to belabor the point. But it's just, there's a lot that goes into a forecast. How did we do? I'm going to show you two forecasts. One is 2009, one is the long-term forecast that we did in July of 2010, of which I've been speaking mostly about today. But I did want to show you the 2009 forecast for U.S. short-term sales, as well as the long-term forecast, and then I'll have one chart on global sales. The reason why I want to show you the 2009 chart you're about to see is that in forecasting, You have to forecast short-term, you have to forecast long-term. So while my staff is forecasting 5 years out, you're going to see at the same time, every month you've got a gun to your head. What are January sales going to be, Mike? What are February sales going to be, Mike? What are March sales going to be, Mike? And I joke that the worse off your company's doing in terms of market share, the more the pressure on you to get supreme accuracy in your forecast. Be exactly right. So there's a lot of pressure on you. So while you're trying to do the long term, you've got to get the short term right. So here's a forecast we did in 2009. GMIA is my staff, Global Market and Industry Analysis. This was our first forecast, January of 2009, roughly 6 months after emerging technically from the Great Recession. We said that 2009 industry sales would be 10,005. Now you can look it up, as Yogi Berra would say. This is in the viability plan that we submitted to the government as we were going through bankruptcy and all the proceedings we went through with the Auto Task Force. If you notice, the blue chips were some of the outside forecasts, and CSM Worldwide were up here. Oh no, 2009 is going to come back. They're going to, in January, they thought they're going to be around 11.5. Then their next forecast dropped all the way to 9.7, and so on. They're bouncing all over the place. It took steel, guts and steel resolve to hold our forecast all the way through. We got a little bit weak need in October, dropped down a little, but basically by the end of the year, we stuck to our 10.5 all the way through, and the actual was 10.6. Why do I point this out? Because in a period, a business can't operate if you're flipping around the industry forecast every month. Oh, it's going to be 10.5, it's going to be 10.3, no, it's going to be 11.5, no, it's going to be 9.5. You can't plan a business that way. You got to be right because you're planning your production schedules to this, your inventory schedules, everything that drives your financials. You got to be steady. So when we make changes in our short-term forecast, we would try to make sure we didn't change more than 2-3 times a year. You got to get that right. All right, how do we do in the long term? This chart shows the long-term trend of auto sales, and they've recovered from every previous recession, the Great Depression, the first oil shock, the second oil shock, the 1991 savings and loan crisis, and now we were in the worst since the Great Depression, called the Great Recession. But we were confident we were going to recover from that. I can't tell you how many hours I spent with the Auto Task Force telling them the auto industry was going to come back and it was going to hit 17 million units again. In fact, you'll see that forecast in a moment. They thought I was nuts. Okay? The thought then was, oh, young people aren't driving. The economy's not going to come back. There's been structural change in the auto industry. There's less vehicles per household. All this data they had, and they brought in a lot of consultants from the Boston Consulting Group. I spent a lot of time at their headquarters in Troy. Finally, after about a month of hand-to-hand combat, we convinced the Auto Task Force, the industry, yes, would come back, GM would come back, and this is a forecast that we had. Now, I can't show you the proprietary GM forecast. I can only tell you I sent a memo to top leaders of General Motors a year ago. Our forecast for GM market share for 2013 was 17.9. The actual number was 17.9 market share. This is our industry forecast. So in 2010, July of 2010, for example, we forecasted 11.8 million units. This includes medium and heavy trucks, by the way, so don't confuse it with just light vehicle sales. We forecasted 11.8 million units. It came in at 11.8. You better get that one right because you're halfway through the year at July of 2010, so you better get that one right. Our forecasts were a little bit on the high side for 2011, 12, and 13. You can see we missed by 600, and 500,000 respectively. And then we nailed to in 2014. We just came out of it 16.8. 17.1 was our forecast for 2015, and in fact, it's the forecast that I'm going to stick with and talk about in a few moments. The bottom line, we accurately forecasted continuous U.S. economic expansion following the Great Recession, i.e. no double dip recession. We didn't forecast it, we were correct. We didn't have a double dip. Finally, as I said at the bottom, you should see our miss, which in the intermediate years was about 0 to 4.4% a year. This is a pretty good forecast. I've had some bad ones in my career. I've had good ones and bad ones. This was a pretty good one. We also forecast global sales will recover by 2014 to 86 million. The actual came in at 87 million. That was pretty good. So what's the outlook for 2015 and 16? This is what we're
Labor
in
force
participants, right? We were in the trough of the Great Recession not too long ago, 2009, and now we're at a peak. Where's the turning point? Just like in the Great Recession, we forecasted the economy was going to come back. Where are we going to peak and start to go down again? Well, we've got a lot of favorable developments. Q4 real GDP grew 2.6%, weaker, but still fairly good. Consumer spending was a strong Q4, 4.3%. But as Professor Weiglar's mentioned, we're getting drags now on our GDP from net exports because of the strong dollar. U.S. did add 257,000 jobs in January. Unemployment rate's gone up. Not bad, because more people are looking for jobs. I'm going to talk about that. Young people 16 to 24 have dropped out of the labor force. They're now starting to re-enter. Consumer sentiment increased to a level of 98.1 in January. It decreased from a very strong 98.1 in January to 93.6 in February, but still it's very strong. The Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index moderated to 53.5. Single unit housing starts increased 7.2% in December. Home sales also increased. That's a positive. Oil prices rebounded. Now, I'm with Professor Weiglar. Low oil to me is good, but the stock markets are schizophrenic and they think, oh, if it gets too low, that's bad. I don't share that view, but this assuaged the stock markets that Brent and West Texas Intermediate WTI oil prices did moderate and stabilize at $61 and $52 respectively. In the January seasonal annual adjusted rate, or SAR, for vehicles remained strong at 17.1 million, with a 6-month moving average at 7.23. Unfavorable developments. Higher than expected inventory buildup by businesses in Q4. That means things are slowing. Labor force participation rate increased to 62.9, but it's still really low. Retail sales decreased more than expected, down 0.8% in January. So we had a strong Q4, but a weak January. Housing starts and home sales remain far below the pre-recession levels. Russia, UK, and Middle East conflicts are continuing. Russia's probably going to enter a recession. Worries over global slowdown are increasing with weak growth in Europe, Japan, China, South America, and financial market volatility has increased. Saw the stock market in December. It stabilized a bit lately, but trust me, it's going to start getting volatile again. And the Fed recognizes these uncertainties and the strong dollar impact on the U.S. economy. So the Fed is going to raise rates, but they're being very cautious, as Professor Weiglar said. My guess is it won't be till later in the year, maybe even the first part of next year, they'll raise the Fed funds rate. So looking at the data, as I mentioned, and this is kind of repetitive, the U.S. did add 257,000 jobs in January, which is the blue bar, and the unemployment rate is, I think, approaching full employment right now at 5.7%. And that's because the labor force participation rate is starting to come back to normal as young people enter the workforce. This chart's pretty enlightening, how the labor force participation rate has really fell from over 67% back in 2000 to down to 62.9% in January. A little bit better, but still really a drop-off, and particularly young people couldn't find jobs and dropped out. So you may see the employment rate tick up a little bit as these young people enter the labor force, and hence the unemployment rate may look a little worse, but it's actually better, because that means we're nearing full employment as these young people enter the workforce. Housing starts have come back, but way below previous levels. I've become convinced that the previous levels in 2005 were a bubble. I don't know we're going to attain them anytime ever again in the next 10 years. I think housing is reaching its peak as far as it's going to go in a more normal lending environment by banks. Oil prices have plummeted. This shows Europe Brent spot prices and U.S. gasoline prices. If you look at U.S. gas prices, they've been moderating to about $2.25 a gallon. I think because of the price of crude oil falling to where it is around $50 a barrel, that's driving these oil producers that produce oil from oil shale out of the market. Even at that price, many of them can't make money. That's going to take some supply off the market and bring oil prices continue to rise. As I said, the industry seasonal adjusted annual rate is strong at 17.1. 17.23 on a 6-month moving average, but you can't do that forever. You can see from this chart, we tend to peak at around 17 million. So what's my forecast for 2015 and 16? I think the economy is going to peak in 2015. I think this will be a good year, but in 2016, gross domestic product and vehicle sales are going to decline, and CPI, interest rates, and oil prices rise. Let me talk a little bit about this. We're still peaking. We haven't quite reached full employment yet, but we will this year, in my estimation. And we'll have a good GDP growth, about 3%. Unemployment will reach full employment. I think that's about 5.4%. I think housing starts are going to peak at about 1.2 million. We're at about 1.1 now. And I see a gradual increase, finally, the CPI, just a modest increase to 1% a year. As we start to get near full employment and wages go up, that drives prices up. I see the 10-year Treasury note coming back a little bit to 2.4%, because I believe near the end of the year, the Fed's going to start raising the federal funds rate. Interest rates tend to move together, and inflation also tends to bring up nominal interest rates. I think crude oil will stay down this year. We recover modestly to $55 a barrel, but as some of those oil producers get forced out, it's going to drive oil prices up next year, as you can see, to $70 a barrel. And I have vehicle sales. I'm sticking with the forecast we made in July of 2010 that vehicle sales will hit 17.1 million. For next year, the slowdown will come from the strong dollar, which is going to continue to decrease exports. That's a drag on GDP. From the higher interest rates you see, I've got the 10-year Treasury note going up to 3.2, and inflation starting to rise to 2.5% as we hit full employment, driving up wages and prices. Housing market peaking, so you're not going to get much boost from that. And when you put that all together with the higher oil prices at $70 a barrel, you've got consumers have been affected. They got to pay more at the gas pump again. They've got higher prices they've got to deal with in terms of inflation. That's a drag on their incomes, and their spending is going to be affected by that, as well as I said, the drag on exports because of the higher dollar, and the higher interest rates also affecting business investment. So I have the economy, GDP dropping to 2.5%, and vehicle sales dropping from their peak of 17.1 to 16.5. Finally, in summary, I hope that you now clearly see that economic forecasting is as much as an art as it is a science. It's a challenging occupation, but I personally think the most exciting thing you can do in economics, because you're putting it out there, what you think. And you're going to be right and you're going to be wrong sometimes, but it gets the blood pumping. Secondly, our forecasts made by global market and industry analysts, analysis back in 2010 in the post-Great Recession era, they weren't perfect, but they weren't too bad. We didn't do, oil prices, we didn't see this fall off, but we got vehicle sales pretty good. And I've laid out my 2015-2016 U.S. economic forecast for you, and we'll see how I do. And finally, given the uncertainty inherent in predicting future economic conditions, along with the pressure by management and forecasters to, quote, be accurate, as I said, being an economic forecaster is not for the faint of heart. So thank you very much. I look forward to